Just hold on a sec. Hello everyone, this is Huyền from Vietnam and really nice to meet you guys today. Welcome to the new direction is Asia 2021. I really hope that you guys enjoyed the previous presentation so far and welcome to the spotlight on ASEAN English Teacher Proficiency Framework for local teachers in Southeast Asia with our presenter Subhan. So as you may know, currently the presenter Subhan, he's the lecturer in the Australian National University, and he has spent lots of time on the presenting today. I really hope you guys will enjoy this one too. During the presentation, if you have any question, just let us know in the chat box, and we are glad to reply to you after the presentation. And for now, I will hand over our session to Subhan. Thank you.
Thank you, Huyen. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, I hope you can hear me well. I would like to share my screen. So this presentation was funded by the British Council. It is drawn from a research project that I've been doing for them. English as a subject in basic education in ASEAN, in association of Southeast Asian nations, the 10 countries in Southeast Asia. The study has been generated from data appearing in the two monographs that will be published next week. Both of them will be listed in the list of references. The title of this presentation is English Teachers Proficiency Frameworks for Local Teachers in Southeast Asia proposal. Here's the overview of the presentation. There are 5 major components of the presentation. The first one is policies on language proficiency in ASEAN. Second one is why not the CFR. The third one is contextualize English teachers proficiency frameworks. The fourth one is sample descriptors, and the fifth one is conclusion. Let's get to the first segment of our presentation, policies on language proficiency in ASEAN. So in ASEAN, in the 10 Southeast Asian nations, there are diverging practices. There are different policies when it comes to language proficiency. There are countries that have no policies on language proficiency, and these are Cambodia, Laos, the Philippines, and Myanmar. There are 2 countries that implement the same policy, and they are using Cambridge GCE. What is the Cambridge GCE? That is Cambridge General Certificate of Education, and the levels that they're aiming are ordinary and advanced level. So it's either ordinary or advanced level depending on the level of education of the students. There are ASEAN member states that favor the CFR. 3 of them have already implemented it, and one is preparing for it. The countries are Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia. The policies on language proficiency in ASEAN, when it comes to CFR-based policies, as I said, there are countries that have already implemented it, and there is a country that is currently preparing it, right? So what are the countries that have already implemented it? The first one is Malaysia, the second one is Thailand, and the third one is Vietnam. In Malaysia, teachers at any levels are required to have a C1 of the CFR. And by the CFR here, that means the Common European Framework for Languages. In Thailand, teachers at primary and secondary levels have different requirements. For teachers at primary level, the government requires them to be able to demonstrate proficiency at a B1 level. For teachers at secondary level, they are required to have a B2 level of the CFR. In Vietnam, it is also quite diverging because a B2 level is required for teachers at primary and lower secondary level, whereas teachers at upper secondary level, they are required to have a C1 of the CFR. Indonesia is trying at the moment to follow the policy that is implemented in Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. So that's why talks for a B2 level for English teachers in Indonesia are currently underway. So there are some senior academics. One of them is Professor Willy Renandia, and the other one is Professor Joko Nurkamto, who have been in talks with the Ministry of Education to implement a proposal for a CFR policy in Indonesia. There is no definitive acceptance to their proposal yet. However, it is more likely that in the next 2 years, Indonesia is going to go with the CFR, just like what is happening in Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. So if you are wondering what the CFR looks like, then with the various levels that are used in Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia, these are the ones. These are the levels of B2 and B1 implemented in those countries. So B2 level and B1 level, these are for independent users, right? So for independent users, for B2 level is much higher than B1. With B2 level, you have more complexity, you have more fluency and spontaneity, right? As opposed to B1, right? So for B2, more complexity and more fluency and more spontaneity. Whereas B1 is less complex, right? Less fluent, and there is less spontaneity. In addition, there's also more clarity and more detail. So when it comes to the production of text, for example, then somebody at a B2 level is expected to be able to produce clear, detailed text on a wide range of subjects, etc. Whereas somebody at a B1 level, they are not required to be able to do that. They are only required to be able to produce simple connected text on topics which are familiar or of personal interest. Moving up to the next level, which is C1, and that's for proficient users. Students or teachers at this level, they are expected to be able to perform at a more complex and demanding longer text and spoken, longer written and spoken text. They have to be able to express themselves fluently and spontaneously and with more flexibility, more structured, in a more structured manner, right? And with more detail, right? So that's C1 level. Now, the next part of our presentation is why not the CFR? What is the resistance to the CFR? The tendency now in ASEAN is that there is a great tendency, there's a strong tendency to adopt the CFR, right? There are many countries that are considering the CFR. The Philippines is considering the CFR. Myanmar is also considering the CFR. So that's based on my research. However, there are reasons to disagree, right? And these reasons, they are manifold, right? There are many reasons, and I would like to outline some of those in this presentation. The first one is that there is lack of empirical evidence based on second language acquisition research. One is by Figueras and the other one is by Professor Jan Holsten. There are many SLA-based criticisms. One of them has to do with the idea of language development and language learning, which are basically different, but they have been conflated in the formulation of the CFR. The other things relate to the descriptors themselves, which many find are ambiguous or unclear in many ways, especially when it comes to generalizing criterion or generalizing competency or generalizing complexity and accuracy, the other aspects of second language acquisition. The other thing about the CFR is that according to the formal document of the CFR identifies translanguaging. However, it does not tackle it. So the newest document of the CFR was published a year ago, and it only mentions translanguaging briefly. It does not really incorporate translanguaging into the descriptors. In other words, it does not tackle translanguaging. What is translanguaging? That's basically the idea of using features of different languages flexibly, right? As if they are one linguistic repertoire. If you are familiar with code switching and code mixing, then you're looking at languages as separate systems, right? So you're looking at English and Vietnamese, for example, as two different systems. You're looking at English and Japanese as two different separate systems. However, in translanguaging, you're looking at them as one unitary linguistic repertoire, one unitary system. In the CFR, translanguaging is not mentioned. Later on in my presentation, I will identify how to incorporate translanguaging in a new framework, which is part of my proposal. Now, what about the ELF? If you are familiar with the theory of English as a lingua franca, as proposed by Professor Barbara Seidelhofer and Professor Jennifer Jenkins, then you know that CFR is not adopted. Sorry, ELF is not adopted in the CFR. As a matter of fact, the adoption of ELF in the CFR is rather vague, according to Professor Tim McNamara from the University of Melbourne. And then data from my study suggests that there are unreasonable expectations in terms of using the CFR in Malaysia. The government requires a lot from the students. However, they allocate very limited hours. They allocate very limited time to the students to learn. So the level of expectation is this high, but the time allocated to the students to learn is this low. So there's a huge discrepancy happening in Malaysia. In Thailand and Vietnam, prescribed CFR levels may be too high because many students and teachers simply cannot achieve them. And these are comments from participants from those two countries, voices from Thailand and Vietnam. In Thailand, that's the comment, the results of nationwide testing of qualified English teachers also indicated a general lack of proficiency A1 or A2 on the CFR. So these are the most common results in Thailand. In Vietnam, most people, right, most students graduating from pre-service level, they haven't reached the CE1 level yet. So that's a huge problem happening in Vietnam. In other cases, the CFR makes no room for plurilingualism. That means the use of different languages at different levels of proficiency, because the focus in those countries, right? The focus in those countries is mainly English. It's only English, no Vietnamese, no Bahasa Malayu, no Thai. It's only English, no indigenous languages in Malaysia, no indigenous languages in Vietnam and Thailand. So that's a big problem happening in those countries because of the high level of language endangerment. And then the next one is that there are mismatches between curricular contents, assessments, and the CFR descriptors. And this particularly are found in Malaysia and Vietnam. What does that mean? That means that when the CFR descriptors are introduced to the teachers, right, the curriculum is already there, right? The curriculum is already there, but the descriptors have just come in. The textbooks are already there, right? And the assessment procedures are already there, but they don't match. They don't match because the CFR descriptors are rather new. So now in Malaysia and Vietnam, teachers are confused how to reconcile the mismatches, how to reconcile the differences between curricular contents and assessments and textbook or teaching materials with the CFR descriptors. In Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, the CFR is unsupportive to learning transition because there's no explicit guidance as to how students can transition from primary to secondary education in terms of social skills, in terms of language development, as well as biological development. So in those countries, participants have noted the idea of having a contextual framework that can support learning transition for students to move smoothly from primary to secondary education. The next part would be the non-accommodation of SEA-TCF. What is SEA-TCF? That is Southeast Asian teachers Competency Framework. This is a general competency framework made by ASEAN nations for teachers in the Southeast Asian nations. So they want every teacher in the 10 countries to be able to follow that. Well, of course, because the CFR is European-based, then there's no room for SEA-TCF either. Now, the most important part that makes up the argument against the CFR is the fact that the CFR does not really identify teachers' ability to use the English language in the classroom. The CFR does not measure one's skills to cultivate the English language to teach. And that is a statement from a Vietnamese participant. People just care about the use of English in general context. They don't really care about how teachers use English to teach, how teachers use English to facilitate instruction. And that is a major problem of the CFR. Now, for this reason, then most of the participants have argued that it is important to develop an ASEAN-based teachers' proficiency frameworks. And these teachers' proficiency frameworks are contextualized. They are based on the culture of learning of people in the ASEAN nation, and they are based on recent applied linguistic theories and approaches. So how do we deal with that? I come up with the idea called a two-pronged approach. We need to be able to approach proficiency in 2 dimensions. The first one is general English proficiency framework, the first dimension. And the second dimension is the use of English for teaching. That's the second framework. As with the first framework, we use GPF, or General English Proficiency Framework, for students and teachers. So both of them are included, whereas the second one is intended exclusively for teachers. That's called English for Teaching Proficiency Framework. Now let's get going to the next part, which is General English Proficiency Framework. What are the working principles? The first working principle is that the General English Proficiency Framework distinguishes language activities. As you know, there are receptive skills and productive skills. However, these are not the only one, because when it comes to language activities, we also have interaction and we also have mediation, and these have to be included. The next one is the use of English for general purposes other than teaching. And this spans different domains such as personal, social, educational, occupational, and spiritual. The next part would be the alignment. The alignment between language proficiency, syllabus, curriculum, language tests, and textbooks. So as in the CFR, General English Proficiency Framework needs to be able to demonstrate this alignment. So one thing we learn from the CFR is the alignment between these components of pedagogy that needs to be reflected. The next working principle includes parameters that shape language use. And these are situational context, the type of text, the theme that's used in conversation or in written communication, the conditions and the constraints. And then it also encompasses dimensions of language use. What are they? According to SLA research, we have the CAF, which is complexity, accuracy, and fluency. However, many scholars disagree with that now, and I personally disagree with that, which is why I come up with this. We have complexity, fluency, intelligibility, and appropriacy. So as opposed to accuracy, which is very much based on native speaking norm, then we have intelligibility. And by intelligibility means the idea of using the language to be able to understand other people and to be able to understood by other people, rather than following the norm of the native speakers rigidly. The next one is the idea of our framework to embrace new perspectives in applied linguistics. And this includes plurilingualism, ELF, English as a lingua franca, and pluricentric English. So that includes the use of indigenized varieties of English in the ASEAN region. So that would include Singapore English, the Philippine English, Brunei English, Malaysian English. And then English for Teaching Proficiency Framework will include all of those working principles included in the general English proficiency, and then it goes more because it also includes translanguaging. It includes scaffolding, right? And by translanguaging here, as I said, that's the flexible use of different features of different languages as one linguistic repertoire. So that means when a Vietnamese teacher teaches in the classroom, then the person will use Vietnamese, the Vietnamese language, and English in different times according to different needs of the students, depending on the level of the students. And this has to be done judiciously depending on the circumstances. And everything is seen as one linguistic repertoire rather than two separate systems. So that's translanguaging. The English for Teaching Proficiency Framework will also have to include scaffolding. And by scaffolding here, that means the idea of teaching, helping the learners to be able to do their work so that they reach the level where they can do tasks, where they can do activities without the assistance of the teacher, without the help of the teacher, so that they can be fully independent, so that they can be fully autonomous. So scaffolding can happen in terms of language and in terms of teaching cycle. So when it comes to good teaching, everything has to be scaffolded according to the level of the learners. So scaffolding teaching with learners at beginners level would be different from scaffolding teaching with students at higher levels, such as upper intermediate or advanced level. In terms of teaching cycle, then there are certain procedures that have to be followed, from presentation to the idea of training the students, to the idea of collaborating, to the idea of presenting ideas, and to the idea of producing a project, right, as part of assessment, for example. So these are the procedures of a teaching cycle that need to be done, that need to be covered in scaffolding. And the next part would be the incorporation of CEA-TCF. One aspect of the CEA-TCF is the idea of helping the learners to be able to reach independent level, which is basically the theory of language learning autonomy. Language learning autonomy, for example, has been in ascendancy in the past few years, and now many teachers in Southeast Asia have tried to develop activities and tasks that can promote learning autonomy in the classroom. This needs to be included as part of our framework, and that is not tackled in the CFR. And we need to be able to promote that in our framework. The next one is aspects of language teaching. What are the aspects of language teaching? The aspects of language teaching will have to include elicitation, and by elicitation that includes inviting participation, offering cues, and etc. And then providing rich language input, providing appropriate language models. So the type of language models that can be used for the students that they can develop for their own preferences. Some of the teachers may want to introduce the learners with American English. Others may want to use the British English. Others may want to use their own indigenized variety of English. So this needs to be handled carefully and needs to be included in our framework as well. And then repair, that has to do with giving feedback to the learners, which can be done directly or indirectly. And then providing explanation, explaining things, explaining the lesson to the students, which needs to be done accurately and thoroughly. And then the other thing is the ability to improvise. Teaching doesn't have to be rigid. Teaching should not be controlled too much. Teaching has to be flexible, which is why a good teacher is always flexible. A good teacher always improvises to the idea that he or she can meet learners' needs in different circumstances at different levels. The next one is classroom management. Our framework needs to be able to include language for classroom management, dividing tasks, One of them is about dividing tasks, dividing units of lessons, dividing assignments. Assigning role of students is another one, whether the students have to do it individually, whether they have to do it in pairs or in groups. The idea of controlling interaction with the students, whether the teacher interacts with the students themselves or whether the students interact amongst themselves. This needs to be ordered as well. And then the teacher needs to be able to give order, to prohibit, or to give encouragement to the learners. So there are specific language for classroom management expressions that have to be tackled in our framework. Intercultural language teaching is also part of it. So the teacher will have to create context for intercultural learning, to notice and question intercultural differences, to compare and contrast intercultural differences, and to draw connections between cultures. Usually it's the culture of the students or the native culture and the target culture. And the next one would be translating and interpreting intercultural points. The next part would be the inclusion of digital technology. With the ascendancy of technology, then we cannot deny that most learners now learn language through digital means, and the teacher will have to be adaptable to the situation. They need to be able to mediate synchronous computer mediated communication of CMC and also to mediate asynchronous CMC. They need to be able to use language and expressions that can help them set up tasks and activities using digital resources. They need to be able to assign students to utilize digital resources for learning purposes and to conduct assessments using digital resources. So these are all the aspects that have to be included in our framework. So if we look at the diagram, then it looks like this. We have two circles in here. We have the big circle, which is English for Teaching Proficiency Framework, and the small circle is General English Proficiency Framework being included in there. And we have different components, right? We have different components. Everything is included in English Teaching Proficiency Framework, except that the framework also includes other things that are not included in the General English Proficiency Framework. So for example, aiming for plurilingualism is part of General English Proficiency Framework, and it is also part of English Teaching Proficiency Framework. And then we have elaboration on the use of English in general. That's part of English Teaching Proficiency Framework as well. However, using language for teaching aspects, right? Different expressions, etc. for elicitation, for repair. These are exclusive to English for Teaching Proficiency Framework, right? But they are not included in the General English Proficiency Framework. The same thing with digital technology, using language for classroom management, translanguaging, intercultural language teaching, and scaffolding. Let's go on to the next part. Okay, now I would like to show you sample descriptors that have come as part of English for Teaching Proficiency Framework. And for this one, we choose one proficiency area, and that's called translanguaging. So by this, that means the use of translanguaging for teaching. One of the major criticisms related to the use of the CFR is the unclarity of the idea of complexity, accuracy, and fluency, because the reliance on the accuracy means the reliance on the native speaking norm, which is why here I would like to propose the idea of combining intelligibility and complexity. So intelligibility in replacement of accuracy. So what we have here is intelligibility and complexity as one bar. And then in the criterion, we have different columns, right? Can use English and different LV, as in linguistic varieties, to provide language model, and then can switch from English to different linguistic varieties and vice versa to provide language input, to convey relevant information, and to explain in English and the relevance of specific information found in a particular section of a long complex text presented in different linguistic varieties and vice versa. And for this, then we'll have to measure them according to this column. So the first one is one being unintelligible, unclear, unstructured, basic, and unsophisticated. Moving on to the next one, that is somewhat intelligible, clear, and structured. And the next one would be intelligible, clear, and structured, and developed. And the last part would be intelligible, very clear, and structured, well-developed, and sophisticated. As you can see here, each of them has got different points. From the lowest one, it's got 5 points. Moving up to the next one has got 10 points, 15 points, and 20 points. And then after that, we can accumulate the points in here. And then the next part would be fluency and naturalness. The idea of fluency has been accommodated in second language acquisition research. However, naturalness is a new thing. So that's why I would like to include it, because the use of language should be natural, not only in the way the language is spoken by the native speaker, but also when the language has developed as an indigenized variety of English. So for example, when we have the Philippine English, then it is the use of the Philippine English by the Philippines people naturally. So for this reason, then we have 4 different columns, one experiencing slowness and much pausing, strain, or hesitation. The other one showing relative ease with some pausing, strain, and or hesitation. The next one showing good fluency and spontaneity. In the previous one, we don't have spontaneity. In the third one, we do have spontaneity with little pausing, strain, and or hesitation. And the highest level would be somebody who could talk naturally, effortless, flexibly, right, with unhesitating flow and with ability to improvise. So 5 points, 10 points, 15 points, and 20 points for each of them, gradually moving up to the highest level. And what are the criteria? As you can see here, there are several criteria. One of them would be the ability to switch from English to different linguistic varieties and vice versa to elicit information. And then to use alternative forms of expressions in English and different linguistic varieties when teaching, to do repair, to switch from English to different linguistic varieties and vice versa to repair. That's to give direct feedback, indirect feedback, and so on. To divide tasks, units of lesson, assignments, to assign students and divide their roles, to control interaction with and between students, to give order, prohibit, and or encourage students, right? I know that some of you may be wondering what it means by linguistic varieties. By linguistic varieties, that means it could be different languages, it could be different dialects from the same language, or different registers, right? So different dialects of the same language, or different register of the same language or the same dialect. So it all depends. I'll give you one example. Indonesian is a lingua franca in Indonesia, and it is drawn from Malay. So Indonesian has got many different dialects when it comes to linguistic varieties. If I'm not mistaken, we have more than 20 linguistic varieties associated with Indonesian. There's one big language in Indonesia called Javanese, and we have at least 38 dialects associated with Javanese, coming from Central Java up to Yogyakarta and East Java, as well as the island of Madura. So that's what I'm talking about. So bilinguistic varieties, that means could be different languages, like one national language and another major language, or different dialects coming from the same language. And then translanguaging for teaching, the next part would be about appropriacy. And by that means the ability of considering students' levels and the needs of the students, as well as the situation involved. And for that, then we have columns, we have different columns, from not being appropriate to somewhat appropriate to the levels and needs of students and or the situation involved. And the last one would be appropriate to the levels and needs of students and or the situation involved, with different points coming from the lowest one to the highest one. So what is the appropriacy part in terms of criteria. In terms of criteria, we have at least 3 of them in here. One is the ability to grade English and different linguistic varieties for various teaching purposes, suiting to the level of the student. So by that, that means the teacher is able to grade the language. He or she can use different elements of his or her linguistic repertoire, right? Different linguistic resources, so that he or she can use them for students at different levels, right? So for students at lower level, right, the use of language is different from students at a higher level. So that's the idea. And then the next one would be the use of English and different linguistic varieties to mediate, to take on different roles. So when the teacher is in the classroom, the teacher is able to do different roles. And these roles are performed according to different needs of the students and the situation involved. Sometimes, for example, the teacher will have to be a bank teller and the students would be the customer, right? So the student is the customer and the teacher is a bank teller. Sometimes the teacher is someone who gives directions and then the student is somebody who asks directions. That's what I meant by taking on different roles. And then the next one would be the idea of the teacher to alternate between English and different linguistic varieties to repeat and to clarify in order to simplify instruction and or make something complex accessible. So that's the idea of grading the language as well, to the point that the teacher is able to simplify the content rather than simplifying the linguistic elements per se. Okay, so with these ideas in mind, how do we determine level of proficiency? To determine the level of proficiency, then we need to have all the points being accumulated and they have to be divided by the total points, right? And the total points serve as 100%. And the results are categorized into the following. So we have 8 different levels. This is a work in progress, by the way, so there may be changes over time. I will consult this with experts in different areas. One of them would be Professor Tim McNamara from the University of Melbourne, because I'm interested in knowing his thoughts about my presentation. So for now, my idea is to have this in 8 different levels, from basic, intermittent, limited, developing, competent, proficient, skilled, and expert. And as you can see on the right side, you can see different percentages of the total points, from 29.99% up to 100%. So somebody who is proficient in English would have the score between 70 to 79.99%. Someone who is skilled in the English language would have would have a point between 80 to 89.99%, and so on. So let's have an example here. The total points of a proficiency area, for example, translanguaging is 280, and somebody accumulates the points of 175. So what does that mean? So if we go back here, we have the 3 slides and we have different we have different criteria. If we accumulate all the points from here, from the intelligibility and complexity, from fluency and naturalness, and from appropriacy, and right, from all these aspects, then somebody could have 175 points in total. So when we would like to measure his language proficiency, then the proficiency level of that person in terms of translanguaging is 175 divided by 280 multiplied by 100%, which is 62.5%. And that falls under the competent category. So that person is a competent user of the English language. Mind you that this is not an overall score. This is only in one proficiency area, and that's only translanguaging. If we would like to have the overall score, then we will have to accumulate all the points from different proficiency areas. And I haven't done those, right? Because this is just a preliminary work, you know, for something bigger in the future. So as I said, what is important here is to look at things specifically, but in a holistic manner. What we have with the CFR is that we have things in a holistic manner. It is very comprehensive. It shows alignment between language proficiency and textbook and syllabus and curriculum. However, in terms of specificities, then it's got lots of problems. And based on the research of other scholars that I have read, then I have come up with this idea, and I hope that this would tackle the problems regarding the specificity in the CFR. Now, the conclusion, which is the last bit, as we can see, Western-based proficiency frameworks such as the CFR may not work optimally. Countries that have been using the CFR have got many issues, they've got many problems, and one of the reasons is because the CFR is not contextualized. So that's why we need something contextualized. We need contextually relevant English proficiency frameworks. These frameworks are needed. This is the way forward. Why? Because it also adopts recent theories and approaches in applied linguistics, things that are not covered in the CFR at all. And for that reason, then I come up with this two-pronged approach to English proficiency. One is General English Proficiency Framework, and the second one is English for Teaching Framework. And for that reason, then I highly recommend the conduct of research to develop descriptors of the frameworks, something that needs to be done collaboratively with many scholars in the ASEAN and in the ASEAN region, in the Southeast Asian nations. So that's the end of my presentation. That's the references. Thank you very much for your attention. And then to the moderator, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that. And really thank you for the informative presentation. To be honest, I really enjoyed it. And we also have some questions from our audience. So the first one, regarding tank language, what would you recommend for a multilingual setting, international students in a second language setting?
Yeah, it's very difficult, to be honest. This is the kind of question that I fear the most. I mean, I have just come up with the idea of descriptors for translanguaging because I know that translanguaging is not covered at all. So my idea would be the incorporation of different linguistic varieties, okay, of different linguistic varieties in a certain nation. So for example, let's take Pakistan, right, as a nation. So in Pakistan, they have Urdu, they have English as well. So Urdu is an official language, and then English is also an official language. And they also have indigenous languages. So the major indigenous languages, or even the small language, indigenous languages spoken by students within the area, will have to be mastered by the teacher so that the teacher will be able to use different linguistic resources from different indigenous languages. And this has to be done flexibly. And what I have given you is limited to the descriptors that I have there, that I have presented, but the overall philosophy is that the inclusion of as many linguistic varieties as possible. Of course, it is impossible to have a teacher who can master 97 different languages in one nation, right? In Vietnam, there are 85 different languages in one nation. In Indonesia has got 706, and nobody speaks 706 indigenous languages. It's impossible. However, the idea is to cater for as many indigenous languages or in linguistic varieties in the classroom as possible. Yes. Okay. The next one.
Yeah. The next one we have from Jamie. Are there rules on translanguaging? It sounds like something we have done when trying to communicate in another language. But is there any guidance on what the ratio should be between English and other language?
Yes. I was expecting this question. Thank you very much. There are no rules for this, to be honest. David Noonan, in his book, The Self-Directed Teacher, has already explained it. There are no rules to this. Things have to depend on circumstances. Things have to depend on the needs of the students. There are circumstances in which students require the teacher to use more English. There are circumstances in which students require the teacher to use less English. In the end, everything is up to the teacher, right? And his or her assessment of the situation in the classroom. So if you want to say 50-50, I don't think it works that way, right? Nothing works 50-50. Like in Korea, they would like to have teaching English through English, right? It doesn't really work because the teachers themselves oppose the policy. So in the end, it has to be flexible, right? The teacher has to be flexible. The teacher has to be adapt, right? The teacher has to be able to adjust to different circumstances. There are things, for example, like grammatical explanation, which cannot be done in the native language. However, there are features of the English language which can be explained, right, in the native language, and that's totally fine. The whole point is about communication being conveyed. Yeah. Okay, and then the next one is also about translanguaging.
However, we have the third one, which is quite interesting. So, quick question regarding the points available. Why do we lowest level get awarded 5 points? Is 0 points possible?
Okay. Yes, 0 points possible. I don't think anybody would get 0. I mean, even in IELTS, the lowest is 1. So if you look at IELTS, I'll just Google it. So I'll share this with you. So this is from IELTS, and then that's the conversion from IELTS to the CFR, right? The lowest in IELTS is 101, and that's beginner. And the score for that, hang on. Yeah, the score for that is 4. Okay, that's the one. Non-user, intermittent user, extremely limited user, and so on. And that's the what is it? That's the corresponding scores in IELTS. As you can see, for non-user, the score is 1, not 0. So even somebody taking this, I don't think 0 would be applicable, but a level 1 would be possible. So as I said, this is a work in progress, right? I haven't really discussed this with anybody, but for this, there's a possibility for basic to be expanded. So the basic level may be expanded to a lower one, such as beginner or elementary, but I would be interested in hearing other people's thought. I think there's another question regarding to the use of L1 for a teacher, a Vietnamese teacher in a Cambodian context. In this context, translanguaging doesn't seem to be very helpful. Yes, of course, if the teacher is a Vietnamese teaching in Cambodian and then the teacher doesn't speak Cambodian, then I don't think that's going to work, right? In that context, that means the teacher will have to use English as much as possible and to use, you know, probably some phrases that are useful in the Cambodian language to help the learners. What are the phrases? Then the teacher will have to find out. Probably it's about drawing students' attention. Probably it's about explaining grammar. Probably it's about using different vocabulary in different contexts, right? Everything has to be assessed by the teacher. In the context, translanguaging only works, right, in situations where the teacher and the students share the same native language, okay? If the teacher and the students do not share the same native language, then the teacher has an extra job, right? And the extra job is about using different linguistic resources to accommodate the needs of the students as much as possible. Yes.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
So we haven't got any so far, but
okay.
Really thank you for answering those.
Thank you very much for the attention.
Yeah, it's quite useful for all of us, and that's the spotlight on ASEAN. I hope all you guys enjoyed it and enjoy the conference as well. Really, thank you.
Thank you very much, Huyen. Thank you, the session host.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank
See
you,
you guys
take care,
soon.
and see you next time.
Yeah, see you.
Okay,
Bye,
bye-bye.
guys.
Bye.